Thank you. I want to tell you a story tonight about a bird named Martha. This is Martha in her cage, an aviary at the Cincinnati Zoo. And I'm really just going to tell you the end of her story. She dies on September 1st, 1914, on a warm afternoon. And what's remarkable about the death of Martha is that when she passes away, an entire species vanishes from the earth. The passenger pigeon was once the most abundant land bird on the planet. At the time of the European conquest of North America, it's been estimated that there were between 3 billion and 5 billion passenger pigeons. An early ornithologist of the 19th century, Alexander Wilson, once observed a flock of passenger pigeons that passed from Indiana over the Ohio River into Kentucky that took not 1 day, not 2 days, but 3 whole days to pass. He estimated that the flock spanned 240 miles across the sky, so that wherever you looked, from horizon to zenith to horizon, all you saw were these beautiful brown and blue birds with these deep red eyes. He also estimated that this flock numbered, conservatively, in his words, conservatively, 2.2 billion birds. So that was about half the population of the species at the time. And for many years, I tried to understand what that meant. What was 2.2 billion pigeons like? We have no wildlife spectacle like that in North America today. And so I wanted to make that flock, that spanning the sky flock, somehow more linear. And I did a little thought experiment, and I asked some friends with better calculators than I had to do a little arithmetic for me. And what we came up with was this. If that flock of 2.2 billion pigeons had flown single file, beak to tail, assuming each pigeon was about 16 inches long, that flock would have spanned the equator of the Earth more than 22 times. So how is it that we go from that kind of biological profusion to just one bird in a cage in a zoo in Cincinnati, whose centennial of the death we mark next year? Well, I like this image here because it sort of gives us a capsule natural history of the passenger pigeon. You can see these strong wings, the strong chest. These birds could fly for obviously days at a time, up to 60 miles per hour. You see the flocks flying through the air here. They were a colonial species, and by that we mean they moved in great flocks. They roosted in the winter in the southern part of what would become the United States in the deciduous forest in massive numbers. And when they moved north to breed in the upper Midwest and the eastern tier of lower Canada, they had these vast nesting colonies. So they were a colonial species, and this makes sense if you're predator is a hawk, because you are able to protect yourself in such vast aggregations. But we can also see in this sort of capsule natural history of the passenger pigeon a couple of other things. The nuts here, that's the food that they would eat, the mast that they would eat out of the forest. But we also see houses on the horizon. So the extinction of the passenger pigeon is hastened by the destruction of those forests as we cleared the land for farm fields, for settlements, for towns, villages, and cities. And we also see, and this is harder to notice, but there's a man standing here with a little bit of a top hat on. He's holding a stick, and there's a little rope that goes here behind the tail. He's a pigeoneer. He's a commercial pigeon hunter. This was a big industry in 19th century America. So as the hunting of the passenger pigeon increased from sustainable levels from indigenous cultures, because they were good to eat, and most of my research early on as I was looking at the passenger pigeon actually was in libraries with cookbook collections. He is trying to draw these birds in, and what he's doing is tugging on this rope, which is attached to a passenger pigeon that has its eyes hooded or even sewn shut so its eyes will not betray to the wild flocks what's going on. So he pulls on this rope, the pigeon flutters and draws in the wild birds. And that's the origin of the term stool pigeon. So this commercial pigeoneer is bringing these birds in. Sometimes they would sow grain onto fields and soak the grain in alcohol, so the birds would come down to feed. They'd be drunk, and they'd be easier to kill. I won't go into all the gory details, but passenger pigeons in these vast colonies were easy to kill through these methods and in other ways. They could walk with these sticks through the forest, knock the nests out of the trees, take the young birds out of the population, because the squabs were the ones that were most prized by restaurants and wildlife markets in the eastern part of the U.S. So we go from 3 to 5 billion birds to a handful of birds to just one bird. And the decline of the population was so fast in the late 19th century that these commercial hunters and settlers and others were trying to figure out what had happened because they couldn't put together the story. Habitat destruction, overhunting, and other factors. So they had theories like, well, maybe all the pigeons flew to the Gulf of Mexico and drowned in a storm, or they all migrated to South America. But the causes were more mundane than that. So this is the last photograph of Martha in Cincinnati on a block of ice, sent back not to a market, not to a restaurant, but like her wild kin, who were shipped on ice on the railroads, and as the telegraphs and railroads increased in the U.S., then the nesting colonies were further decimated. This is a picture of Martha leaving the Cincinnati Zoo on a block of ice, bound for the Smithsonian Institution, where she remains today. So what could have saved this species in the late 19th and early 20th century? There were attempts in places like Michigan and Wisconsin to protect the last nesting colonies of the passenger pigeon from these large-scale hunting operations. But it was too little too late. But if the Endangered Species Act had been in place, surely the passenger pigeon would still be with us today. And although they needed apparently these large numbers in the wild to trigger successful breeding behavior, in captivity, they bred readily. But the paradigm of the day was not to cooperate. It was to compete. So no one at the Cincinnati Zoo contacted anyone in Milwaukee or Berlin or any other place that might have had passenger pigeons to pool resources. So the birds died off in these different zoos and in these different institutions. Cooperative captive breeding would have saved the species. But no one would have thought of this. The paradigm wasn't in the air. You might say that those were heresies that no one could have embraced at the time. So we have some lessons that we can learn from this. And I think they're obvious lessons. They're important ones. And I think they're sort of the first step. And the first step is that we have to remember this story. As I said, next year is the centennial of the death of Martha, and it's important to remember this story. It's an amazing story of ecological collapse. And we can say never again. Let's not have this happen. But we're saying that at a time where we're in the midst of a mass extinction event. So these are concepts that we draw from such things as ecological grieving and environmental memory. They're important, they're necessary, but they may not be sufficient because the times are fast. And this is the point at which we all want to rush out the door and go bowling or have a drink and not hear this again, but I'll say it very briefly. CO2 emissions are up, they're not down. We have record levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. We're at 400 parts per million. Britain's Royal Society has estimated that if we stay on the emissions path we're on now, and hopefully we won't, but if we do, we'll be at 1,000 parts per million at the end of the century, and that's civilization-ending levels of CO2. A recent study, these are headlines about this study, and I think the second headline tells us what we need to know. By 2047, the coldest years may be warmer than the hottest years in the past. So we're heading toward a tipping point. So I mentioned this word heresy, and the word hope has come up as well. Heresy is some kind of dissent or deviation from accepted wisdom, from common beliefs. Hope is a kind of wish for something to be or to come true. I think we should redefine hope from wish to work, at least as far as environmental problems are concerned. And what I want to ask us is what can work today? What are the heresies that might save the biosphere and civilization from our own worst habits? Well, this is a list of some heresies that will probably raise some hackles, might induce fear and loathing on the part of the general public and environmentalists for sure. Things like nuclear power, genetically modified crops, voluntarily modifying humans to reduce our resource consumption, de-extinction or bringing species back to life, a two-planet biosphere, geoengineering, which is the deliberate technological intervention into the climate processes to cool the planet down. These are big, risky things, but they might be the things that save us. And how would you feel about these if I told you, so for example, in the case of nuclear power, that James Hansen, who is the NASA scientist who brought the greenhouse effect to public consciousness in the 1980s, and who's been arrested in front of the White House for protesting the inaction at the federal level on dealing with climate change, is one of many climate scientists now pleading with environmental groups to at least look at the possibility of safe nuclear power as part of the energy equation to get us off fossil fuels. Genetically modified crops hold the promise of resisting drought and extreme weather events, which are increasing because of climate change, and could feed billions of people. Bioethicists and philosophers are talking about ways that we could use hormone therapy, pharmaceuticals, and genetic engineering entirely on a voluntary basis because smaller people eat less food. De-Extinction. Stuart Brand, who is the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, is funding an effort to bring the passenger pigeon back to life. And this is fraught with questions. You would use a surrogate species to hold the cloning material, and would it be a passenger pigeon? Could we release these into the wild? So a number of questions about all of these potential heresies. More science fictionally, Mars is a wild sanctuary. If we ever get the space program on track, can we get to Mars, terraform it, and make it a place for humans and for animals to exist? Closer to home and closer in time. Geoengineering, there are two things you can do with geoengineering. This is, again, the intervention into the climate processes to cool the planet down. There's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, so let's take some of it out. There are scientists and engineers working on this, sort of creating an artificial tree. It's unproven technology at present. It could be very expensive. We know that volcanoes know how to geoengineer because when they erupt, really big ones like Mount Pinatubo, they put a layer of sulfur aerosols in the atmosphere at the stratospheric level, and it reflects sunlight back into space. If we can do that, we might be able to cool the planet by 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. A lot of questions. Who decides if we have the capacity to do that? What triggers geoengineering? Do we need more research? Who pays for this? What are the effects on regional climate? So none of these possible heresies are easy fixes, but we have to begin to look at them. What I want to ask is if heresy is our hope. What if crazy, and these ideas will sound crazy to some people, what if these are the things that are left, given the tipping point that we seem to face in the climate by the end of the century? I'd like to see an environmentalism that stops asking if only and starts to ask what if, because we're the ones who decide. And I think that if we look back at Martha's story, we can see that a combination of humility and boldness might have saved the species. Humility to learn from the mistakes of our past, the boldness to do something new, perhaps dangerous, but something new that could save us. And as we think about that word heresy, which has a kind of negative connotation, I would remind us that the Greek root word of heresy means one simple thing. It means to choose. Thank you.